This incident happened on a winter night last year. Delivering pizza on cold winter nights can be tough, but you get used to it when you work in this job. That night, I had to make a delivery to one of the outskirts of the city. The address was a lonely house near a wooded area. The cold and darkness of winter were already creepy, but it was part of my job. When I arrived at the house, it was a large old farmhouse. The surroundings were covered in snow, and there was only a faint light seeping from the windows of the house. I got out of the car, took the pizza, and walked towards the door. There was no doorbell at the front of the house, so I had to knock on the door. I waited for a while, but no one came. I knocked again, and this time I heard footsteps from inside. The door slowly opened and an old woman appeared.
Oh, thank you.
"Pizza," I said, smiling slightly. She looked at me and nodded as if she recognized me. While she was taking the pizza, she gave me a strange look. While she was paying, I tried to peek inside. The house was dark and cold, with only a light coming from the kitchen. The woman's hand trembled as she handed me the money.
I'm sorry, young man. We don't get many visitors here.
I nodded and wished her a good night as I walked back to my car. But just at that moment, I was startled by a sound coming from inside. It sounded like a scream. I turned my head and looked back at the house, but the woman had already closed the door. I got back into my car and started the engine. As I drove away, I felt a strange unease. Something seemed off. I kept thinking about this incident on the way, the fear in the woman's eyes and that sound from inside. The next day at work, I told my colleagues what had happened. They love such stories, but no one really believed me. A few days later, I got another order from the same area. This time, as I made the delivery, I passed by that old house. I stopped out of curiosity and asked the police what had happened. They said the old woman had died a few days ago. At that moment, I thought about what I had experienced a few days earlier. Maybe that scream was the old woman's cry for help. Perhaps it was a last-minute call for assistance. After that incident, I always felt uneasy about orders from that area on winter nights. When I remember that old farmhouse in the darkness and the fear in the old woman's eyes, I feel a chill inside. And sometimes, I feel a sense of regret for never fully solving the mystery of that night. Sometimes the city can be really eerie at night. After midnight, the streets become silent and the shadows under the streetlights grow longer. It was one of those nights. I was doing my usual pizza delivery. One night I took my last delivery of the shift. The order was for a quiet neighborhood far from the city center. Everything was calm, except for the occasional passing car. The delivery note mentioned that I needed to knock because the doorbell was broken. There was nothing else. Just that the address was for a small apartment behind an old house. When I entered the neighborhood, the dark streets between the houses and the buildings that looked almost abandoned made me a bit uneasy. When I reached the delivery address, I went through the narrow passageway behind the house and entered a small courtyard. The courtyard was completely empty except for a few broken chairs and a rusty bicycle. As I approached the door, I heard faint music coming from inside. It was a bit comforting. At least someone was inside. I knocked on the door and waited. No sound. I knocked again and waited a bit more. Then, I heard faint footsteps from inside. The door opened slightly, and someone looked at me from the darkness, but I couldn't see their eyes. "Pizza," I said, raising my voice slightly.
The door opened a bit more, and a young man appeared. He thanked me softly and took the pizza. As he handed me the payment, I noticed his hand trembling.
Meanwhile, my eyes drifted to the dark room behind him. Only a candle was lit, and strange shadows danced on the walls. I couldn't see anyone else in the room. The man handed me the money and said in a shaky voice,
"Good night."
Before quickly closing the door, I turned and started walking back to my car, but at that moment a sound from inside stopped me. It was a muffled scream followed by a heavy thud. I pressed my ear against the door, but there were no more sounds. That sound had made me very uneasy. As I walked back to my car, I noticed something moving in the courtyard. At that moment, my heart almost stopped. A shadow slowly emerged from the corner of the courtyard. I ran to my car in fear, quickly opened the door and jumped inside. I started the engine and sped away from there. That night at home, I kept thinking about that moment, the man's trembling hands, the strange sounds from inside, and the shadow in the courtyard. The next day at work, I told my colleague what had happened. My boss mentioned that orders from that area were usually problematic and that many strange incidents had occurred there. I never took another delivery to that neighborhood, but still, some nights I can't forget the muffled scream I heard while passing through that narrow courtyard and the shadow I saw in the dark. Sometimes I think that young man is still there, hiding from something in his dark room, and each time, I realize how ordinary and safe the other houses I deliver to are. I was earning my pocket money by delivering pizzas at night. This incident happened about 4 years ago on a cold winter night and has become a memory that still sends shivers down my spine. That night, the weather was extremely cold, and it was snowing. Around 11 o'clock, we received an order from a quite luxurious residential complex. I had delivered pizzas to this site many times before, so I knew the address. I prepared the order and set off. The roads were snowy and slippery, so I had to drive carefully. When I arrived at the complex, I went through the usual ID check at the security gate. The security guard knew me, so I quickly got inside. The address was a large, impressive villa at the far end of the site. When I reached the villa, I noticed that the lights were off. This struck me as odd because such places are usually well lit. I got out of the car, took the pizza, and walked to the door. I knocked, but there was no response. Just as I was about to turn around and leave, the door slowly opened. Standing there was a well-dressed, middle-aged man. His eyes looked tired and worried. "I brought the pizza," I said.
The man silently nodded and invited me inside. As I entered, I noticed that the inside of the house was much darker and colder than the outside. The man said, "Sorry, it's a bit messy here."
Looking around, I saw that the furniture was disordered, some pieces moved, and there were broken glass fragments on the floor. "Did something happen?" I asked.
The man replied, "Just a little argument," and closed the subject. The man directed me to a large table in the middle of the living room. I placed the pizza on the table and waited for the payment. At that moment, I heard a faint rustling sound from a back room. I sensed that something was wrong. The man took out his wallet and handed me the money. However, I noticed his hand was trembling.
"Is everything okay?" I asked.
The man replied, "Yes, I'm just a bit stressed," as I was about to head towards.
As I opened the door, I heard a woman's voice. She was shouting, "Help me!" I immediately ran in the direction of the voice and opened another door. In front of me stood a young woman with her hands and feet tied, her mouth taped, and her eyes filled with fear. The man quickly came up behind me shouting,
"You need to get out of here."
Realizing I didn't have time to rescue the woman, I rushed outside to call the police. I got into my car, drove away quickly, and reported the situation to the first security guard I saw. The security guard immediately called the police, and officers arrived at the scene. When the police arrived, the man tried to escape but was caught. The woman was taken to the hospital and she was okay. After this incident, I continued delivering pizzas for a while, but this event always lingered in my mind. This unforgettable experience taught me that people are not always as they seem, and that one should always be cautious. My name is Jack. I work as a pizza delivery guy in a small, quiet town in America. The job is usually relaxed and uneventful. I drive around familiar neighborhoods and deliver orders. However, what I experienced last week was so terrifying that it shook me to my core. That evening, it was around 8 and I was at work. It was a busy night and orders were coming in one after another. I was preparing to return to the store after my last delivery when one more order came in. The address was in a more remote, deserted part of town that I rarely visited. I didn't want to go there, but a job is a job, so I had to accept it. I started my bike and headed to the given address. As I approached the neighborhood, the number of streetlights decreased. Some streets had no lights at all. As the roads became narrower and darker, a strange uneasiness crept over me. It wasn't hard to find the address, but the house looked more eerie than I expected. Its yard was neglected, the door was rusty, and it was oddly ajar. I approached the door cautiously and rang the bell. There was no sound from inside. I tried a few more times, but still no response. I didn't want to leave without delivering the order because that could cause problems at work. I pushed the door a bit more and called out through the gap, "Hello, your pizza is here." And I heard a rustling sound from inside, but no one answered. I decided to go in. As I stepped inside, a musty, dusty air hit my face. In the middle of the living room were old furniture that looked like they hadn't been used in years. There were piles of newspapers and papers on the table. I called out again in a trembling voice, "Hello, I brought your pizza. Are you here?" Getting no response, I moved further in. A faint rustling sound from the hallway caught my attention. I followed the sound and entered a small room. It was completely dark inside. I turned on the light on my phone to illuminate the room. At that moment I noticed a figure curled up in the corner of the room. My heart started pounding. I approached cautiously, and as my eyes focused on the figure, I recoiled in horror. It was a mannequin dressed in old clothes, a sort of puppet. Just then I was startled by a voice.
What are you doing here?
I turned around to see an old, creepy-looking man standing at the door. I couldn't guess his age, but the deep wrinkles on his face and his cold gaze frightened me. I replied in a shaky voice, I brought pizza. Did you order it?" The man slowly nodded and approached me. As he came closer, he took a key from his pocket and locked the door. At that moment I felt a surge of fear. Seeing the door lock, I thought I wouldn't make it out of there safely.
Come here, this way, we're waiting for you.
For a moment I didn't know what to do. I thought about running, but the door was locked. The man was standing right in front of it. Then suddenly, I noticed that the back door was open. Summoning all my courage, I pushed the man and ran towards the back door. I could hear him shouting behind me, but I kept running without looking back. I reached the backyard and jumped over the fence into the dark streets. When I reached my bike, I was still out of breath. I quickly started it and sped away from there. When I returned to work, I was still in shock. I told my boss what had happened, but he didn't really believe me. After that incident, I learned to be cautious with every order. The dark and deserted streets of the small town no longer seemed as appealing to me as they once did, but no matter what, I will never forget what I experienced that night. The night I started working at a pizzeria to pay for my college tuition, I usually worked in the evenings and returned home around midnight. My job was simple: take orders, put the pizza in the car, and deliver it to customers. However, one night, an incident occurred that changed everything. It was around 10 p.m. that evening, and the weather was gloomy. I was about to take my last order and noticed that the address was a bit out of town. Although I didn't like going to such places, it was my job and I had to do it. I entered the address into the GPS and set off. As I drove, the streetlights became fewer and the roads narrower. Eventually, I reached the address and found a dilapidated house in front of me. The surroundings were dark and quiet. I got out of the car and took the pizza. As I walked towards the house, I felt a sense of unease. I knocked on the door and waited. There was no movement. I knocked again, still no answer, just as I was about to turn back. The door slowly creaked open. A thin, pale man emerged from inside. His clothes were old and dirty, and his eyes glowed in the darkness. "Did you order a pizza?" I asked. The man only nodded and extended his hand. I handed him the pizza and immediately felt that something was wrong. His hands were cold, almost like the hands of a dead person. Without a word of thanks, he closed the door. At that moment, I took a deep breath and hurried back to my car, wanting to leave quickly. I got into the car and started the engine. As I looked into the rearview mirror, I noticed movement in the back seats. Blinking, I looked again, but there was no one there. Telling myself to stay calm, I continued driving. However, a few minutes later, I felt the same sensation. This time, when I looked in the rearview mirror, I clearly saw someone sitting in the back seat. I felt like I was suffocating inside the car. I slammed on the brakes and jumped out, my heart pounding wildly. Summoning all my courage, I opened the back door. It was empty. Taking a deep breath, I got back behind the wheel and started the car, but I could still feel something following me. When I returned to the store, I told my boss what had happened. He laughed and said, "The night shift has worn you out. You need some rest." But I knew what I had experienced that night was real. At that moment, I decided to quit. The night shifts. As I left the store, I saw a shadow behind me. I quickly turned around, but there was no one. After that night, I never went back to that neighborhood. I still remember the man's cold hands and the dark figure in the back seat.